Standard critical histories of mystery and suspense fiction have many things in common. In addition to agreeing that Edgar Allan Poe basically invented the genre in 1841 when he published The Murders in the Rue Morgue, there is also a great deal of consensus about the fact that after Poe, the next significant innovation in the genre had to wait until Sir Arthur Conan Doyle introduced Sherlock Holmes to the world in A Study in Scarlet, which was published in 1887. There are exceptions to this rule, of course. Some critics recognize the importance to detective fiction of Wilkie Collins's 1868 novel, The Moonstone, and in particular, his character, Sergeant Cuff. Others, including Catherine Nickerson, have done valuable work on later 19th century American female writers of mystery novels, such as Meta Fuller Victor and Anna Katharine Green. On the whole, however, critical common sense still tends to see a gap in the history of mystery and suspense fiction between the two giant figures of Poe and Doyle. The truth is much more complicated. In this lecture, we'll examine the importance of the dime novel to mystery and suspense fiction. Thanks to the effort of critics such as Michael Dennin and Pamela Bedore, today we have a better understanding than ever of what exactly dime novels were and why they are so important to the genre. The dime novel is an underappreciated but crucial early influence on modern forms of mystery and suspense fiction. The range and complexity of dime novel crime narratives enables us to understand what happened between the genre-founding work of Edgar Allan Poe and the explosion of mystery and suspense fiction in the 20th century. The dime novel is also a great illustration of the importance of formula in the genre and an early example of the generation of niche audiences for a very wide range of products. It was responsible for introducing and popularizing what would go on to become many of the foundational features of the puzzle mystery and hard-boiled mystery fiction. Let's begin by asking a deceptively simple question. What is a dime novel? The term has been used to describe a wide variety of cheap 19th century American fiction, including the story paper, the cheap library, and even some early pulp magazines. All of these forms were diverse and cheaply priced products designed for wide distribution among working-class readers. The first American story paper was called Brother Jonathan and was founded in New York by Park Benjamin and Rufus Griswold in 1839. Like its successors, Brother Jonathan contained a wide array of different elements, including serialized stories, letters, humorous pieces, fashion advice, and a miscellanea of arcane knowledge. The most direct ancestor of the dime novel proper was the pamphlet novel, which in turn was an offshoot of the story paper. In 1842, the story paper New World issued what it described as a shilling novelette that retailed for 12.5 cents as an extra to the story paper. The pamphlet novel, while popular, proved to be a short-lived experiment, as increases in postal rates put the pamphlet sellers out of business in 1843. The idea of cheap novels for a mass audience persisted, however, and inspired the beginning of the true dime novel. In 1860, a small New York publishing house owned by the brothers Erastus and Irwin Beadle began to issue a weekly series of pamphlet novels under the collective title of Beadle's Dime Novels. Thus, the dime novel was born, and it immediately became a massive success. By 1864, according to one reviewer, The popularity of dime novels was almost unprecedented in the annals of booksellers. A dime novel is issued every month, and the series has undoubtedly obtained greater popularity than any other series of works of fiction published in America. Not surprisingly, competitors to Beadle's dime novels soon appeared, including Sinclair Towsey's American Tales in 1863, Eliot, Tomes, and Talbot's 10-cent novelettes, also in 1863, George Munro's 10-cent novels in 1864, and Robert DeWitt's 10-cent romances in 1867. Despite the fact that the market for dime novels quickly became quite crowded, their readership continued to grow, and the success of this new form of popular literature was assured. What can explain the rapid and immense success of dime novels? Part of the answer is rising literacy rates during the middle decades of the 19th century in America. This rise led to a growing demand for cheap and accessible literature, a demand that dime novels both satisfied and stimulated. A more immediate cause, however, was the American Civil War. Dime novels were extremely popular with both Union and Confederate soldiers during the war, and demand was so great that by the time the war ended in 1865, the Beadle brothers had published over 4 million dime novels. The popularity of dime novels among both soldiers and civilians can also be attributed to their content. The first novel in the Beadle dime novels series was titled Malaeska, the Indian Wife of the White Hunter by Anne S. Stevens, which was a reprint of Stevens's earlier serial that originally appeared in the Ladies' Companion magazine in 1839. Malaeska proved to be typical of many of the stories that would appear in the other dime novels published by the Beadles in the years to come. First, although original stories became the norm as the genre developed, many of the early dime novels were reprints of tales that had originally appeared in the story papers. Second, Malaeska was a melodramatic and adventure-filled tale of frontier life that involved evil Indians, heroic white settlers, and Western settings. The association of the dime novel with the frontier eventually became so well established that when Frank P. O'Brien, one of the earliest collectors of Beadle's dime novels, donated his collection to the New York Public Library in the 1920s, he gave it the collective title American Pioneer Life. This was partly because the term dime novel had taken on pejorative associations by the 20th century, but also because, in the words of the New York Public Library catalog, the O'Brien collection is literally saturated with the pioneer spirit of America. It portrays the struggles, exploits, trials, dangers, feats, hardships, and daily lives of the American pioneers. The way in which dime novels mythologized and celebrated the westward expansion of the United States and the ideology of manifest destiny was a big part of the reason these novels were so popular. So how did they later acquire the reputation of being unsavory, even dangerous potboilers? The first generation of dime novels usually consisted of standalone stories, but beginning in the 1870s, series characters began to appear and quickly became very popular with readers. This is where the dime novel becomes relevant to mystery and suspense fiction. The first dime novel detective was a character by the name of Old Sleuth, and he was the invention of Harlan Halsey, a former director of the Brooklyn Education Board. Old Sleuth first appeared in the story paper The Fireside Companion in 1872. But he soon became so popular that he merited his own series, and so George Munro began publishing the Old Sleuth Library in 1885. Apart from being the first of his kind, Old Sleuth is an important figure in the pantheon of dime novel detectives for several other reasons. Halsey was the first author to use the word sleuth to describe a detective. Originally, the word had been used to describe a bloodhound that was trained to track. And he's also responsible for the popularity of the use of the word old in the names of competing dime novel detectives, such as Old Cap Collier, Old Broadbrim, Old King Brady, Old Ferret, and many others. The majority of these characters were not actually elderly. For most dime novel detectives, old was used to describe the detective's considerable experience and wisdom rather than his age. In Old Sleuth's case, it also referred to the fact that one of his favorite disguises was to dress himself as an elderly man while investigating cases in order to avoid suspicion. But Old Sleuth is also important because his appearance marks the beginning of a gradual shift in the dime novel genre away from frontier themes and toward crime stories, frequently with urban settings. For many critics of dime novels, this shift from pioneer to detective was seen as a decline. Writing in 1928, for example, the critic Henry Morton Robinson argued that the period between 1870 and 1900 witnessed the rise of the train robber and detective as the protagonists in paper-covered literature. It marks also the decline of the House of Beadle and the triumph of the cheaper elements in dime novel publishing. If earlier dime novels had celebrated adventure and daring do, according to critics like Robinson, crime-themed dime novels were more sensational than adventurous and appealed to the lowest common denominator rather than inspiring manly pioneer sentiments. From our point of view, as fans of mystery and suspense fiction, of course, the picture looks very different. The emergence of the dime novel detective was the way in which the genre responded to the increasing urbanization of the United States. As more and more Americans lived in cities rather than in rural areas, the dime novel, a genre that had always been in sync with what its audiences wanted, responded by moving its heroes away from the frontier and into the city. At the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, eminent historian Frederick Jackson Turner gave a paper entitled The Significance of the Frontier in American History, in which he claimed that the era of westward expansion in the United States was over and that the frontier was now closed. Turner's audacious claim quickly became gospel truth, and it confirmed Americans' perception that the age of the frontier was over and the age of the metropolis was beginning. The emergence of the dime novel detective personified that shift from the frontier to the city. As critics like Richard Slotkin have argued, the man who knows Indians that characterized frontier literature was now replaced by the man who knows criminals in the urban dime novel. We can also see that dime novel detectives responded not only to the fact of American urbanization, but also to anxieties created by that urbanization. Not unlike the way in which Edgar Allan Poe's Auguste Dupin was able to demonstrate his mastery over the urban landscape of Paris in The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Mystery of Marie Roget, so dime novel detectives like Old Sleuth demonstrated their ability to both explain and control dangerous urban spaces by hunting down cunning criminals in American cities. With all this said, it's also important not to overstate the importance of urban settings for the dime novel detective. For one thing, as critic Edward T. LeBlanc has pointed out, there were detective characterizations in many of the frontier and mountain stories. For example, a dime novel by George Henry Prentice entitled The Marked Bullet that appeared in 1864 contains a detective-like figure connected with an alleged murder committed at a house raising in Ohio. In a similar vein, in Edward S. Ellis's novel, The Web of Fate, which was serialized in 1866, the detective figure pursues a bank robber on the prairies. These examples indicate that Old Sleuth, the first character to be explicitly described as a detective in a dime novel, had antecedents in earlier dime novels, and those earlier incarnations of the detective figure plied their trade on the frontier before moving to the city. Moreover, even when the dime novel detective's move to the city was underway, the transition from frontier to city didn't happen instantaneously and wasn't complete. Even those dime novel detectives, like Old Sleuth, who knew their way around the city, were also distinguished by their ability to work effectively in a variety of settings. Thus, for every dime novel with a city setting, such as The Dock Rats of New York or The Smuggler Band's Last Stand, you can also find a title like The American Detective in Russia, which features Old Sleuth and stresses the mobile nature of the detective's skills. Part of the success of the dime novel detective story, in other words, is that it integrated and updated many of the tropes of earlier forms of dime novels, such as diabolical villains, cruelly treated damsels in distress, and last-minute miraculous escapes from dangerous situations, rather than simply rejecting those tropes. It's also important to emphasize that many other detectives appeared in the titles published in the Old Sleuth library, in addition to Old Sleuth himself. In fact, Old Sleuth only appeared in about 25% of the novels. The variety of settings in dime novel detective stories and the fact that this figure soon became enormously diverse provide us with a perfect example of mystery and suspense fiction's ability to both generate and satisfy the demands of a large number of niche audiences. Again, a quick selection of Old Sleuth library titles gives us a sense of how various the category of the dime novel detective was by the end of the 19th century. Two Wonderful Detectives, or Jack and Gill's Marvelous Skill, Cad Messy, the Female Detective Strategist, or Duty Done Again in the Field, and one of my favorites, Firebomb Jack, or Freaks of a Mystery Man, are a few representative titles. As Edward LeBlanc has pointed out, there were detectives for every conceivable profession, including Old Snap, the postal detective, Old Bullion, the banker detective, and Ward Wendell, the mail carrier detective. In addition, there were detectives named for every major city from Boston to San Francisco, and even female detectives such as Murat, the Western lady detective, and Mademoiselle Lucy, the French lady detective. Once the detective figure became a popular part of the dime novel universe, the ingenuity of dime novel publishers knew no bounds as they sought to exploit this popularity by producing as many variations of the type as possible. But if variety was part of the appeal of the dime novel detectives, the other part consisted of certain conventional elements that appear in the vast majority of such narratives. In other words, dime novel detectives are also of interest to fans of mystery and suspense fiction because they are early examples of the importance of formula in the success of the genre. Most dime novel detective tales begin with the commission of a crime, usually a murder. Once the detective begins to investigate the crime, the dime novel then becomes a series of one exciting and dangerous incident after another, a structure that allows the narrative to be stretched out for as long as necessary until the desired word count has been reached. Typical incidents include the detective infiltrating a criminal organization while in disguise, the detective's true identity being discovered, the detective being captured and tortured, the detective escaping miraculously through a combination of cunning and strength, and the detective finally solving the crime and usually destroying the criminal organization in the process. Because this formula was flexible enough to allow for the addition of many other plot elements as needed along the way, the detective might come across young women who needed rescuing, crooks determined to win an inheritance by foul means, and large amounts of often intense violence. According to the critic Gary Hoppenstand, the most important and innovative formulaic element introduced by dime detective novels was what he calls the inevitable resolution. The Poe archetype of the classical detective, Hoppenstand argues, anticipated the resolution of the mystery, but the reader never felt that the resolution was inevitable. Beginning with Old Sleuth, the dime novel detective, along with his reader, instead saw his victory over a series of challenging circumstances as inevitable. This makes dime detective novels much closer to being adventures rather than mysteries in the narrow sense of the word, but this by no means spoils the audience's enjoyment. Indeed, it was precisely because readers knew the detective would eventually triumph that they were able to enjoy the extreme torments he endured, because they could be certain he would eventually come out on top. Hoppenstand summarizes the difference by describing the classical detective as a pathfinder who picked his way through the mystery by carefully selecting clues that would eventually lead to the detection of the criminal. By contrast, the dime novel detective was a bulldozer who steamrolled his way through clues and criminals on his way to another preordained victory. The importance of formulaic elements in the success of dime novel detective stories might seem to imply that they were all alike, and that there was no reason to choose one over another. And indeed, dime novels were often marketed in exactly that way to their readers, with the main selling point of a new novel being that it was exactly like every other dime novel they'd ever read, which meant that they were guaranteed to enjoy it. But readers still made some characters more popular than others, and it's those characters that stand out in any history of dime novel detectives. Old Sleuth is obviously a member of that select group, but Nick Carter is perhaps the most famous and certainly the most enduring dime novel detective. Nick Carter, or the Little Giant as he came to be known, first appeared in 1886 in Street and Smith's New York Weekly, in a serialized story entitled The Old Detective's Pupil, or The Mysterious Crime of Madison Square. Like many other dime novel detectives, Carter is young, confident, a master of disguise, and a role model dedicated to clean living and family values. He's also superhumanly strong, as the reader learns when we're told that he can lift a horse with ease while a heavy man is seated in the saddle, he can place 4 packs of playing cards together and tear them in halves between his thumbs and fingers. Over the course of his long career, Nick Carter dime novels were written by a large number of authors. The first few were the work of John Coryell, who wrote 3 stories featuring Carter for the New York Weekly. When Coryell decided that he preferred writing romances under the pseudonym of Bertha Clay, Carter was taken up by the indefatigable Frederick Van Rensselaer-Day, who wrote a 25,000-word dime novel every week for an astonishing 17 years, many of which featured Nick Carter. One of the most fascinating aspects of Nick Carter is that he proves how adaptable and flexible the characteristics of a dime novel detective are. For example, when dime novels began to fade in the 1920s, the character was repurposed for pulp magazines as a hard-boiled detective. No longer the clean-living, superhumanly strong boy detective, this version of Nick Carter was more downbeat, and the cases he took on were much more realistic. Beginning in the 1940s, Nick Carter was even able to make the jump to another medium, when Mutual launched the radio show Nick Carter, Master Detective in 1943. The series proved to be phenomenally popular with audiences, not least because of its very distinctive opening, which involves someone pounding urgently on Nick's office door and Nick's assistant saying, "What's the matter? What is it?" The reply was always the same and consisted of a male voice saying, "Another case for Nick Carter, Master Detective." What's interesting about the radio version of Nick Carter is that he combines various elements that had always been present in the original dime novel detectives. This underlines the point that dime novels constitute an archive of early examples of how mystery and suspense fiction would later develop. For example, Nick Carter's radio incarnation was able to be physical with criminals and was adventurous and manly enough to rescue those in distress. In fact, a popular rumor suggested that the phrase, "in the nick of time," originated from Nick Carter's ability to arrive at the very last moment, avert disaster, and save the day. But Nick Carter also had elements of the classical gentleman detective in the sense that he had the patience to perceive and collect clues that led him to the criminal, following a method that he would later share with the radio audience when he explained how he solved the crime. By the time the radio show Nick Carter, Master Detective came to a close in 1955, over 700 episodes had been broadcast, with the actor Lon Clark playing Carter in every single episode. Such was the sustained success of the Nick Carter character in a variety of media that by 1949 it was estimated he had appeared in over 4,000 dime novels, pulps, films, both silents and talkies, including many in French, comic books, comic strips, and radio shows. There are probably more Nick Carter adventures out there than any other fictional detective. And yet, he still wasn't done. Following the success of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels, Nick Carter was reintroduced yet again in a series of novels with the collective title Nick Carter, Killmaster. Run, Spy, Run, the first entry in this series of espionage fictions, was published in 1964. In this incarnation, Carter is Agent N3 of Axe, a fictional spy agency for the United States government. As you might expect, there are many similarities with James Bond, although Carter tends to have fewer gadgets and more action. One definite similarity is the presence of sexual encounters with a variety of women, all of which are described in detail. We've clearly traveled a long way from the boy detective of 1886. And yet, even the Killmaster spy novels featuring Nick Carter have some similarities with the original version of this figure. As with the dime novel Nick Carter, none of the Killmaster novels include an author name. Instead, Nick Carter acts as a collective pseudonym for a large number of authors who contributed to the series over the years, including Michael Avallone, Valerie Moolman, Manon Lee Stokes, and Martin Cruz Smith. Some of these writers went on to write their own successful series of books using still other pseudonyms. There are also similarities between the original and the updated version in that both are unequivocally on the side of good against evil, and both inevitably triumph, no matter how different the methods they use to achieve their desired goal. Although both the 19th and 20th century versions of Nick Carter are masters of disguise. The debt that the Killmaster version of Nick Carter owes to the original is acknowledged explicitly in Dr. Death, the 100th novel in the series, which includes an essay on the earlier Nick Carter and a Nick Carter detective short story, along with a Killmaster adventure. The final similarity between the original Nick Carter and his Killmaster descendant, of course, is that they were both incredibly popular with audiences. Between 1964 and 1990, an astonishing 260 novels were published in the Killmaster series. Although they are below the radar for most readers of mystery and suspense fiction, the Killmaster novels are irrefutable evidence of both the influence and enduring popularity of the dime novel detective. If you're not familiar with dime novels in general, and the dime novel detective in particular, I hope this lecture has convinced you to explore this fascinating genre. I can guarantee that if you're a fan of mystery and suspense fiction, you'll find many familiar elements of the genre in dime novels, including early versions of the armchair detective, the hard-boiled detective, and explorations of themes such as the thin line between the detective and the criminal, and the pervasiveness of corruption. Armed with your knowledge of dime novel detective conventions, you'll also be able to reread familiar texts with a fresh eye. For example, once you're familiar with dime novels, Elmore Leonard's ability to write both westerns and crime novels makes perfect sense. You'll also see that Leonard's novels featuring U.S. Marshal Raylan Gibbons, the inspiration for the television series Justified, combine elements from both genres in a single text, just as dime novels did. Even though you wouldn't usually associate the inventor of Sherlock Holmes with dime novels, take another look at the American episodes in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's work, such as his depiction of Mormons in The Study in Scarlet, and the Irish secret society called the Molly Maguires in The Valley of Fear. You'll see that their emphasis on lurid adventure has much in common with the dime novel. Likewise, if you reread the early Race Williams Private Eye stories by Carol John Daly, you'll appreciate how much they owe to dime novels, with their combination of damsels in distress, family conflicts, and the inevitable triumph of the hero. Even a classic hard-boiled novel like Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest looks different once you're familiar with dime novel conventions. The Western setting of Personville, along with the Continental Op's decision to just bulldoze his way to a solution by breaking up criminal organizations, will inevitably remind you of the adventures of Old Sleuth or the original version of Nick Carter. Pretty much wherever you look, you can find evidence of the influence of dime novels in many forms of mystery and suspense fiction. If you're not familiar with the adventures of dime novel detectives, make them the next thing you read.